On her wedding night, under a sky of rented lights and the careless arithmetic of falling bills, Julia felt a wrongness that had nothing to do with cameras or applause. It arrived as a small, physical thing. The way Mike's hand rested on hers and seemed both warm and impossibly cool, as if one palm belonged to someone who had stepped out of the sun and the other had just touched a window pane. The band kept a steady, amiable rhythm. Guests laughed. A confetti of currency fluttered like overripe petals. He turned to the crowd and opened a black suitcase at his feet, the way a priest might open a chest, and the lights fell into a new alignment. Bright, theatrical, uncomfortably intimate. He did not make a spectacle of himself with bluster. The act was too precise for that. He lifted a thin, luminous cloth, let it catch the stage light so it seemed to breathe. It shimmered like a living coin. Camera shutters stuttered. People leaned forward as if to inhale whatever novelty he offered. He kissed her under that breath of cloth, and the kiss registered on every lens as a consummation. It registered for Julia as if two truths had been layered in the same instant. The one everyone saw, a glamorous, almost cinematic declaration, and a private one that threaded through her ribs like a new seam. She had worn silk that lived and moved against her skin in ways she had rehearsed in the privacy of mirrors. She had taken vows and smiled in photographs. But there was a separate ledger being written across her body that night, an account in small, uncanny increments. A flash captured Maike and the suitcase together. In profile, he looked impossibly admired. Later, in the hush of their suite with the door latched and the city turned into a bed of distant, twinkling paperwork, the suitcase waited by the balcony curtain like a third presence. The hotel room smelled of lemon and the faint after-heat of thousands of bodies. The air conditioning hummed. He set the suitcase down with a careful, almost ritualistic motion, and the suitcase seemed to accept the floor as if it belonged there. She had expected a dozen things from marriage: companionship, the slow arithmetic of laundering and dinners, a public life that would make errands into appointments. She had not written, in any of her private inventories, for secrecy that folded in on itself, for the feeling that the man she chose was also an object he chose to contain. The press loved an image with a prop. For a week afterward, photographs of Maike opening that case, of the cloth lifting like a slow tide, ran in glossy spreads. Headlines did their tidy job of translating visual ambiguity into marketable lines. A ceremony like no other. Love magic and money. Maike's dazzling gesture. Portrait showed him smiling. A well-cut suit and a pocket square. The suitcase a flat black punctuation. They loved spectacle because spectacle gave certainty. It reduced weirdness to a narrative that could be trimmed and tagged. Julia learned to speak the language of spectacle with the same practiced muscles she used to smile for a camera. Measured words, an elegant tilt of the chin, the occasional artful pause that cameras mistook for depth. After the first block of interviews and the flood of congratulatory messages, she sat with a cup of coffee gone quickly tepid and understood, with a clarity that frightened her pleasantly, that what the world had seen that night might be something else entirely beside what waited in private. If this had been a novel she was not yet finished reading, it would have advertised its twist on the spine. Instead, it left traces, small, slippery things, like the way a mirror will keep a smudge even after a surface is wiped clean. She turned the moment over in her mouth like a coin. If you like twisty, slow-burn supernatural stories, subscribe. She told herself explanations that sounded reasonable and practical. Maike was a private man who cherished ritual. The suitcase was a stage prop with sentimental value, something from his childhood perhaps, an heirloom. He had charisma enough to convert any eccentricity into charm. He was also, she reminded herself, the man she had chosen. That was not an insignificant fact. Choice had weight. It pressed down on her shoulders as tangibly as the sash at her waist. Honeymoon brochures lay like small apologies on their own. They had flown east to an island that promised light in sheets and empty beaches photographed empty only in the brochures. On sand, the cameras could not follow them, strictly speaking. Yet Maike seemed to travel with a shadow of attention. Hotel staff learned his name quietly and then said it again with the approximation of reverence. In impersonal suites, the suitcase was always at the foot of their bed, shut, but close. It looked less like a container and more like a votive. Once, in a room where the ocean aired itself in the windows, she watched him stand at the balcony while city lights and shipping lamps melted into stars, and he held the small black case like someone reading scripture under lamplight. There were magazine shoots. A photographer instructed how to place arms on elbows and faces on hands. Sometimes the sequence ended with Maike opening the suitcase and letting the light of the prop glint against his wristwatch. The prop performed. Editors loved the enigma of it. The suitcase photographed as an absence filled with meaning. It made silence appear intentional. Julia learned the angles by rote. She learned how to appear surprised in public, with a face that made the public say, sincere, tastefully astonished. She began to keep a private ledger for other things, small items she found or kept. A leaf tucked in a crease of her shoe after an outdoor reception. Mud on a hem, where he swore he had stood on the hotel lawn to fetch her forgotten bouquet. The texture of the mud lingered like a foreign language. When anomalies arrived, they did so with the slow insistence of weather. A scent first, that was not cologne, nor the perfume she had chosen for the ceremony. It wafted sometimes from the suitcase or from a crease in Maike's collar. Pine. Yes, but mixed with something like rain on metal and cold that borrowed the language of winter. Once, in the thin radiance of dawn, with the city a softened bruise, she woke to find an iridescent speck on the bedside rug. It was no bigger than her thumbnail and gleamed like the inside of a beetle's shell. She kept it in a small velvet box from the hotel concierge, where she liked to store thoughts she could not yet name. When she pressed the scale between finger and thumb, it left no scent on her skin, only a mild, pleasant disbelief. There were moments when his touch felt, for a breath, misaligned. A hand that should give heat left instead the cold impression of glass. A kiss that should close to the mundane practice of affection opened like a seam. She began to watch his hands the way a seamstress watches cloth for irregularities. He could be tender, and he could be careful. He could be monstrous in the way that ocean waves are monstrous, beautiful, and indifferent. She did not have words for the otherness she perceived. She had gestures, notes, the accumulating smallness of things that did not fit. Friends filled roles like good props. They shaped her sense of plausibility. Sonia was dazzling by profession and ancestry. She moved through rooms with the kind of ease that made poverty feel like a faux pas and wealth an accessory. Sonia applauded Maike's theatrics on social media and in person. She called him the kind of husband you brag about, and meant it as the highest compliment. Sonia's world regarded spectacle as a currency and did not look kindly on those who lacked the proper appreciation for it. She advised dinners, placements, introductions, and how to laugh at the correct rhythm to encourage the right kind of press to stay. Kem was the opposite of shimmer. He collected truths the way other people collected stamps, methodical, patient, never amused in public. He had been her friend since before Maike's devotion became a matter of public record. He had been devoted to the idea of the friend who is stubborn when needed. He suggested practical things. Watch Maike's routines, see if the suitcase left marks on the floorboards where it sat. Check for small irregularities in his day that might be explainable. He did not propose dramatic confrontations. He believed in evidence, in the slow undermining of assumptions. He was the kind of friend who would sit with her at dawn with 2 coffees and a spreadsheet if necessary. Dennis arrived sententially. He had been a brief flame in her life years earlier, civil in one phase, frank in another. He appeared less as a steady presence and more as a moral witness, whose job it was to ask the questions that performed righteousness by default. "If you see something that changes who someone is," he said once while they stood on a balcony that looked down on a midnight festival of lights, "don't let reasons make you kind to the wrong thing." He could be blunt in a way that left small cuts, the kind that would not immediately bleed. He worried about the future in the same way a man worries about an unkempt garden, with definite plans for pruning. Julia listened to them all and layered their advice over her own feeling like garments. She wanted practical counsel. She also wanted to preserve the tenderness that was not a lie. That small, steady warmth in moments when he made her laugh, or when he folded his hands around her and simply read aloud from books they loved. She wanted to hold that tenderness without folding it into the spectacle. But tenderness did not answer for the scale under the rug or the small sound in the night that she could not place. A soft, steady hiss at the margins of her hearing, like a distant radiator or the breath of leaves rubbing against a window. She began to collect proof in ways that felt half superstitious and half institutional. The scale she had found in the honeymoon suite lived in the velvet box in her bedside drawer. She touched it when insomnia pressed like a head against her ribs. She kept track of patterns. When Maike would rise, the route he took through the apartment, the times he would insist on walking to the window or the park at dusk. Once, returning from an event where confetti of currency had been theatrically tossed into the air, she noticed fresh mud under the soles of his shoes. She asked him about it. He smiled and said they had driven through a park to avoid traffic and the tires had taken a bite of the lawn. "Such small eccentricities," he said in his measured voice, the voice that could be used in presentations or at late dinners when he spoke of the charity they would fund. "They make stories worth telling." But he refused to call them secrets. He called them personal rituals. When she pressed for the contents of the suitcase, when once she took a hand to the latch and felt its coolness under her fingers, he pivoted to a grammar of privacy that was disarmingly ordinary. "There were things you kept for yourself," he said, as if quoting a proverb. There were talismans that belonged to his lineage. There were small ceremonies that made sense only when you were alone with them. He always asked her permission, in the ways that mattered, whether to kiss, whether to accept a compliment. And in other matters he assumed a kind of authority that she sometimes allowed because it reduced friction. The suitcases of men were always repositories for certain kinds of things. She knew this from watching film and from the careful way people pack. But his suitcase had a quality of dignity that suggested obedience. It was well locked and lined in a soft, dark fabric that rarely saw daylight. When she wore her wedding gown again for a late press photograph, the suitcase sat at the edge of the frame like a guarantor. She began to think of it as a kind of altar, not overtly religious, but quiet in its demands. One evening she visited an old apartment that had once been theirs, Mike's small flat in a neighborhood that had been gentrified into itself. The place held a memory. A single great mirror on the wall, an old tree visible through the balcony like a sentry. He told the story of how he had once sat beneath that tree and waited for a letter that never came, of how the tree had seemed, in its patience, to teach him something. She pressed her palm to the mirror absent-mindedly and thought she saw, for a moment, a shape like a coil in the reflected light. A suggestion of something that might be hair, or might be rolled silk, as if the reflection had been carrying another object that did not exist on her side of the glass. She laughed it off. Mirrors played tricks. She knew this. But later, when she returned to the hotel room, the same coil of thought returned in the hush before sleep. A slow folding in on itself. At a small dinner, when the table was stacked with good food and better wine, Sonia eventually put on her particular kind of face. The prettily frank one that coaxed people into confessing social alliances. Sonia praised Maike's gestures. "There's romance again," she said with gratitude and hunger braided together. We are starved for romance. You are lucky." Her eyes paused, curious, on the velvet box that Julia rested unconsciously on her lap, an awkwardness that was both compassion and the awareness of value. "What is in there?" she asked, light as a spoon tapping glass. Julia said nothing. The velvet box was hers. The box held the one small scale. She turned it so the light slid off the lid and felt, for a moment, as if she were closing a tiny world. Sonia's appetite for stories did not require answers. It required proof. People like Sonia wanted revelation because revelation could be consumed. After the party, Kem took her aside and, in the low, practical voice he favored, mapped their days with the precision of a surgeon. "If he is what you suspect," he said, "you don't expose him to an audience. You learn his routine. You set conditions. You watch him when he's cornered, not when he performs. You make the private a place of proof." "Proof of what?" she asked. "Proof that you can live with ambiguity," he said. "Proof that you can make a life that won't rust under the condition of not knowing everything. Sometimes the question isn't what someone is. It's whether you can hold them and not be crushed by the unknown." His pragmatism calmed her in a way that looked like resolve. She wanted to be the kind of person who could choose with full information. The problem was that full information seemed calibrated against the fabric of secrecy itself. The more she tried to pry, the more the edges of the secret slipped into shadow. Secrets had a way of remaining themselves by shifting the light. The city's edge was a boundary in more than geography. There was a park, ragged and patient, where the great tree stooped over a bench like an old listener. It had been, in their early days, a place of almost ordinary consolation. Two people with coffee, a book, the small comfort of another's presence. After the wedding, when a particular insistence had built up in her chest, she followed Maike there on a particular evening when the light fell wrong, and the city seemed to be wearing a hush, like a new garment. He had told her once that the tree should be respected. "It remembers," he'd said, speaking of the tree as if it were family. "It keeps more than it shows." She watched him from the edge of the path where lamplight made small moons on the cobblestones. He moved with a pace that did not hurry. He walked as if the world had no urgent requests. He carried the black suitcase. The night smelled of damp leaves and street smoke. Some faint metallic scent threaded the air, the same one she had tried to name in hotel bedrooms and photo sets. When he reached the tree, he set the suitcase down with the same ritualistic care he used with the stage. He knelt in the grass and, with a slow, almost reverent patience, unfastened the latches. She stepped forward without deciding to. The bench creaked under her weight like an old witness coughing awake. He did not seem surprised to see her. He had always assumed she would find her way to certain thresholds. He lifted the luminous cloth again, letting it catch the lamplight like a living thing. Where the cloth moved, the air cleared in a small, precise way, like a bell rung at a distance. The soft hiss she had sometimes heard returned, this time more distinct, as if the tree itself exhaled. The light that came from the suitcase was not harsh. It was threaded with the green of new leaves and the dull silver of old rain. There was a coil, less like an animal than a thought shaped into form, that lay folded, patient as a sleeping rope. It was neither wholly beautiful nor wholly terrible. It existed with the ambivalence of memory. He spread the cloth like a tablecloth, laid the coil upon it, as if setting down something he loved and feared in equal measure. There was a tenderness in the way his fingers adjusted the folds, as if he were making a room for an old friend to be comfortable. When he looked at her, he offered no speech that could be transcribed into the grammar of innocent husband or guilty conspirator. He offered choices. "You may come closer," he said. "You may stand at the edge and keep what you have. You may leave tomorrow and keep your account untroubled. The thing is not my demand. It is my nature. Your choice is not one of right or wrong. It is one of seam. Where will you sit?" Julia noticed in that hush that his hands shook a little. The movement suggested not ferocity, but the small tremor of someone who carries things too long. She thought of all the calendars of ordinary days she had scheduled with him, the dinners, the calls to distant relatives, the way he placed her coat when evening had a wind. She thought of the scales in her velvet box, of the humming sound that woke her sometimes. She thought of the way the suitcase had become a presence like a third person in their marriage. She did not rush. Choosing to wait felt like an action in itself. She stepped onto the grass, the sound of her shoes arrested by the damp. The tree watched, its leaves like a congregation that had nothing to be scandalized about. The coil did not uncoil in a way that movies might promise. It did not spring free with a fanged grin. Instead, it folded itself tidy, patient, and when it moved it suggested a language of breathing and ancient textiles. He pressed the luminous cloth into her hands at one point, and the material felt as if it carried weather, cool and slightly damp, like a breeze that has been flattened into cloth. "You can look," he said softly. "You can touch if you want. You can set it back in the suitcase and pretend you have never seen anything at all." "Do you think I could?" she asked. The question was not rhetorical. She wanted to know if ignorance was still possible once a mirror had been broken and the shape beneath it glimpsed. He looked at her as if measuring her in a new unit. "Ignorance is always possible," he said. "It requires courage because it asks you to hold a whole with grace." "What does it want?" she asked. The question was smaller than she expected. It was not about his origin or the nature of his otherness. It was about need. He smiled then, a private smile that did not belong on glossy pages or in interviews. "Company," he said simply, "and care. Sometimes a thing like this prefers afternoon light and someone who will listen without cataloging." It was almost a plea. The image of a thing asking for company struck her with the odd, tender cruelty of the city. There were creatures inside people and people inside creatures, and sometimes the two crossed their arms and sat quietly together like family. She thought of the public spectacle of the wedding and the way cameras could not follow what happened at the edge of a tree in a park. She saw with frightening clarity that she lived in two economies at once. The economy of value that measured weddings in public validation, and the quiet, domestic economy of tending something precarious and unnamed. She asked another question because questions gave her a shape to stand within. "Does it hurt?" He looked away. "Not in the way we use the word. It has its own discomforts. It has needs. It can feel lonely when left out under lights." Julia considered his answer. Watching him across the small altar of cloth and grass, she felt the weight of choice press into her like snow. She had not expected to be an arbiter for the strange thing in his suitcase. She had not expected the moral ledger to require such labor. But there was an odd relief in the clarity of options. A spectacle had given way to a threshold that required a domestic kind of courage. She stayed that night, and they drove home together under a roof of city lights like scattered promises. She slept at first with a strange sense of companionship and the physical knowledge that the suitcase remained in their shared life. Sometimes near the balcony, sometimes by the bed, sometimes absent for hours and then back again as if a guest taking leaves. It occurred to her that life would be a long adjustment. A calendar of small rituals, a suturing of ordinary days around the constant presence of otherness. In the following weeks, the public still loved images and headlines. Maike maintained the mask that charm had taught him. He performed devotion with a precision that made the cameras sigh with satisfaction. Private life, though, expanded the margins of her day. The velvet box lived in the drawer where she kept socks and small necessary things. She kept it close enough that she could touch it when the city hummed in the night. She kept the little scale because it was a proof of a private geometry, an object that betrayed nothing and everything. Friends continued to play their parts. Sonia celebrated with brilliance. Dennis offered awkward concern and then, with a tenderness that surprised her, a willingness to listen without preaching. Kem stayed the most constant. He taught her ways to watch the patterns, how to mark the moments when the hiss came and when it did not, when the suitcase was opened for hours and when it disappeared for an afternoon. He suggested a ledger, dates, times, the soft things like smell, texture, and small telling obstructions. Work filled her days between private curiosities. There were dinners to attend where the right laugh could make an editor write a paragraph about class and modern romance. There were charity galas where Maike gave speeches that made the press swoon. There were nights when she found herself in mirrors, practicing angles of nonchalance. She was learning a double literacy, the grammar of being an admired couple and the grammar of being the keeper of a secret. There were other signs that life would ask for compromise. An old woman in a dry cleaning shop remarked, unbidden, on how bright the suitcase was in the light, as if it were a thing that glowed in some private fashion. A neighbor called to congratulate them, and in a voice that tried to be every shade of helpful, asked if they planned to have children. Each question folded a bit of ordinary future into the present. It asked her to imagine a world where otherness could be domesticated in cradles and calendar reminders. She imagined sometimes a life where she would learn to make room at the edges. She dreamed in brief slivers of sleep that took the form of the tree's leaves, whispering a language she almost recognized. In one dream, she saw herself placing the small scale underneath ordinary objects, keys, a pair of scissors, a pen, like offerings. In the dream, the scale did not care to be a relic. It wanted to be counted among small, useful things. She woke with the glitter of the dream in her mouth, like sugar rubbed into the skin. The city demanded decisions in soft ways. An invitation arrived for a charity dinner where Maike was to be the headline speaker. The brochure featured his face and a small, tasteful photo of the black suitcase open on a table, its cloth falling away like an elegant curtain. The organizers wanted spectacle. They cultivated it. Julia could have refused. She could have created distance. But the decision to attend felt less like capitulation and more like a test of whether public life and private truth could coexist without one erasing the other. On the day of the dinner, Kem sat with her over coffee and mapped a scenario where she could measure him without a public spectacle, indiscriminately dismantling the private seam. "Ask him," he advised simply, using the small verb that carried so much with it. Ask him what he intends to reveal, frame the boundary. If he refuses, you have evidence. If he consents, you keep the language of choice between you. She took the advice as best and as badly as one takes any map. The issue had no clean relief. It demanded conversation and courage in equal measure. When she brought it up casually, an aside over a late plate of pasta, Maike listened with that patient face that had photographed so well. He said he believed in consent, in staged intimacy. He said the suitcase performed better when the audience felt the impression of a private gift. He did not promise restraint. He did not refuse. "You are making a space for me," he said after a small silence, touching the place where her hand lay near his. "I am offering you a life worth the strangeness. I do not wish to do violence to your sense of choice." She understood in that moment the cost of staying would not be the absence of danger, but the accommodation of a new currency of silence and presence. She could, if she wanted, retire from public life and live quietly. She could also attempt to graft both economies together to learn a new household practice of tending thresholds so that daily life would not collapse into spectacle or into secrecy. Each option asked her to be brave in different ways. That night, after the meeting with Kem and the dinner plans and the small necessary concessions made for the day's press, she found herself alone in front of her bathroom mirror, a large, impeccably lit rectangle that had once been a friend in the mundane ritual of grooming. She leaned in close. Mirrors were honest in a particular way. They returned only what you offered, and sometimes offered more, because of the angles. The glass had a coolness that matched the coldness she had sometimes felt against her skin when Maike touched her hand. She lifted her face and watched its lines. The mirror showed a woman who had navigated the public and the private, and had learned to hold both like spinning plates. She noticed a faint smudge on the glass and, wiping it, saw, very briefly, a coil of light across the reflection where no coil existed in the room behind her. It lasted a breath, as if the mirror itself were apologizing for a memory that trespassed. She could have dismissed it as fatigue. She could have placed the velvet box with the tiny scale into a drawer and refused to let it be a thing that governed her nights. Instead, she opened the drawer and with a careful hand set the velvet box among socks and small tools. She closed the drawer slowly as if making a pledge. Later, in bed, Maike was quiet in a way that suggested he was carrying something heavy that did not need speech. He had the grace to sleep without showing her the interior of his life. She watched him and tried to piece tenderness and otherness into a single silhouette. The hiss at the edge of her hearing fell away with the city until only the steady beat of sleep remained. She placed her hand over the velvet box through the drawer's thin wall and felt a steady, small comfort in the weight of what she kept. Days spun into a domestic rhythm that felt new. The ritual of morning coffee, the small arithmetic of emails, the evening guest lists. Anxiety receded into a low, watchful state. She began secretly to catalogue small things that might serve as either proof or reassurance, depending on how she later chose to interpret them. A smudge on a collar, an odd bruised leaf saved in a shoe, a dampness in a cloth that suggested rain, even though no rain had fallen. One afternoon, when the city sky was a paste of late summer cloud, she found herself alone on the bench beneath the great tree, the black suitcase gone from beside her feet. She did not hear the hiss that had become a companion. Not then. But she saw, tucked into the roots at the tree's base, a scrap of mirror, no larger than her palm, that caught the light and made it small and fleet. It sat there like a rumor. She picked it up. The fragment's edge was cool and left a trace of cold in her hand. When she turned the shard over, the reflection was not so much an image as a suggestion, a possibility of him lifted from the public and stretched into something intimate. The shard did not reveal the whole. It did not offer an answer. It held instead a little private architecture of promise and danger. In a pocket of her mind, a ledger clicked open. She wrapped the scrap in a handkerchief and slid it into her coat. She did not yet know whether the thing she held would become a bridge or a trap. What she did know was this. The night of the wedding had rearranged something in her chest. It had made it possible to live in two registers, one public, extravagant, and readable by strangers, the other private, uncanny, and lived like an apprenticeship with secrets. Both demanded that she learn new skills, how to photograph sincerity, how to witness otherness without consuming it, how to steward a life that would not be obliged to explanation. As she walked back toward the city and the life that awaited, the tree's leaves whispered in a wind that could have been pity or counsel. She held the mirror fragment as if it were a small animal. The suitcase, wherever it was, had not yet decided whether it would remain in the world of props or the world of things with needs. She had hours ahead to watch and to plan, to weigh courage against the desire for ordinary days. A phone buzzed in her pocket with a message from Sonia. "You look radiant in the new feature. Drinks tonight? I have a client who wants to meet both of you." The message felt at once like an invitation and a rope. Julia looked down at the shard and felt the coolness reaffirm the choice she had already begun to make. To keep both the public truth and the private secret, to allow the suitcase to continue existing in both economies, while she, carefully, deliberately, decided where to anchor herself. She walked on, the fragment heavy and honest in her pocket, the city breathing around her in half measures and full attentions. The tender hush of the tree lingered in her ears like a score of a song she had almost learned. She moved through the weeks like someone learning to read a language whose alphabet was partial. There were interviews to deliver, speeches to rehearse, dinners that required the precise performance of being both gracious and opaque. There were afternoons when Maike was all solidity, measured humor, hands that folded napkins as if arranging a small, private altar. And there were others when he was a less definable weather, present yet parting, his attention a thin edge that sometimes brushed her and sometimes glanced past. The black suitcase kept its appointments with the city in a way that felt steady and ritualized. At hotel corners, under marquee lights, by the back stairs of venues where the cleaners moved with quiet choreographies. She noticed the suitcase first in reflections, the way it sat like a punctuation at the edge of a frame, and then in the small absences it left behind, like a signature inked in negative space. A new magazine wanted a feature, a long profile, photos of them together in their apartment, an essay on private rituals. The photographer had a way of making interiors look like confessions. On the morning of the shoot, the apartment smelled of citrus and the kind of polish that made glass behave like scripture. Maike arranged the black suitcase at the edge of the sofa and told the photographer it had always been a sort of domestic reliquary. He spoke with the practiced cadence of a man who could make intimacy look like a brand. The camera liked contrast. It ate the way the black surface swallowed light and then offered a single seam of gleam along the latch. Photos from the session ran with captions that invited readers into an aesthetic. People sent messages that were equal parts envy and curiosity. Some threads of conversation were clinical, asks whether Mike's gestures were publicity stunts, others sentimental, imagining them as a modern couple staking out romance in a world of commodity. None, however, noticed the small blister of cold on the inside of Julia's wrist that the lens did not register. Kem visited more often now, practical visits that came with coffee-stained notebooks and a quiet appetite for inventory. He would sit on the edge of the sofa and list things in a voice that was almost ceremonial. "The suitcase is always present in public functions," he said once, tapping an invisible ledger. "It sometimes disappears for a day or two. It emits a scent that is not your average cologne. There are audible anomalies in quiet rooms, and the mirror sometimes shows things that don't have immediate corollaries in the room. You have evidence, even if it's piecewise." "Evidence of what?" she asked. Her voice could be measured. Sometimes asking the blunt question made her feel less like a conspirator and more like an investigator. "Evidence that makes a case for living with contradiction," he said. "Not for explaining it, for living with it." When Sonia called, and she called in a bright, decisive way that made every small plan sound like a gala, Julia found herself swept into schedules that tested the seam between public and private. Sonia wanted them to go out, a client, a dinner, a late-night show where Maike would be presented with an award. The city liked epilogues and spectacle. It needed gestures to explain the present. Julia agreed because refusing always felt like another kind of confession. On the night of the award, reporters clustered along a rope like birds. Maike accepted applause in the practiced posture of men who had learned to eat adulation slowly. He opened the black suitcase on stage, letting that luminous cloth catch the spotlights again, making a small luminous tide for cameras to drink from. Applause followed. Flashbulbs turned the act into a currency exchange. Their intimacy translated into column inches and sponsorships. Julia stood beside him, smiling in a manner calibrated to look both surprised and grateful. The suitcase showed itself obligingly, an emblem that turned private strangeness into a manageable commodity. That same week, a small peculiar thing happened that made her notice how the private acted like an active agent. She came home late, shoes scratching on the threshold, and found the front door ajar. The apartment smelled like nothing she could name, No lemon polish, no stale coffee, just a cool metallic hint that made the hairs on her forearms rise. The black suitcase was gone from where it usually rested by the balcony curtains. On the floor by the window lay a single curved scale, no larger than a fingernail, gleaming with a peculiar pearlescence. She recognized its texture immediately. She had felt that nuance before in the velvet box. She picked it up between two fingers and it warmed, just slightly under her skin as if to answer some small question. She left a note for Maike that said simply, "The case isn't here," and folded it into the vase like an offering. When he returned an hour later, smelling faintly of rain and the city's late rust, he explained he had taken it to an appointment with a donor. He described the donor as part of a philanthropy that enjoys curious displays. He spoke the way a man might speak of a colleague's eccentricities, and then asked if she was tired. His voice contained no duplication of the night's small surprises. "Did you take anything else?" she asked, meaning the scale, the cloth, the small objects that punctuated his rituals. "No," he said. He always said no in a way that sounded truthful, but truth had started to wear layers in their life. She wanted to interrogate, but she also wanted to preserve the tenderness. The two desires pulled at her the way opposite tides might. Dennis, who hovered at the edge of pity and concern, visited with the bluntness of one who wanted to cut away at every falsehood he suspected. He offered advice that read like a manual of sanctions. Leave quietly. Make a spectacle of his deception. Do not normalize what felt like a deception. His words landed like small, efficient knives. "If you stay, you will teach him the contentment of your complicity," he said at one point, furious with a righteous grief that made her want to soothe rather than argue. He could be a moralist who loved the symmetry of admonition. She appreciated the steadiness, if not always the verdict. Julia bristled at the idea of being instructed to respond in a single fashion. She had married in a world that prized clean narratives. She did not want to be handed one without being given the right to shade its edges. "What if the question isn't what he is?" she asked Dennis once, "but whether we can make a household for things that don't fit neatly into taxonomies?" "You would be making room for indeterminacy," he said with a slight unbelieving laugh. "Do you really want that on your conscience, this house of anomalies?" It was not that she didn't fear the consequences, she feared them keenly. The possibility of being laughed at, of being studied, of waking every morning to a new fissure in what she thought she knew. But the thought of leaving him with his thing, alone under lights and in back rooms, felt like an act of abandonment she wasn't certain she could commit. She felt in the marrow that tenderness had been real at times, and that this tenderness could not simply be economized away by moral hand-wringing. The mirror fragment in her pocket proved to have a patience all its own. She pulled it out in idle moments and watched small reflections swim across its face. Once, in the hallway of a friend's apartment, Sonia's, who always kept light like a policy, she placed the fragment on a coffee table and noticed the way it bent the edge of a face into a suggestion. The shard never offered a full truth. It gave partial anatomies, an eyebrow, and then nothing, a mouth that belonged to no single time. There was a small joy in the partiality. She could hold uncertainty in her hand and not feel it as a failure. Not all days were days of anxieties. There were mornings when the hiss receded, and they would read the paper together at the table, feet tucked under chairs, the kettle settling into the kind of rhythm domestic objects get when they are content at being used. He made tea in a way that suggested rituals he had learned with care. He read passages from books aloud when the world became too loud, and sometimes he laughed in that precise way that meant his attention had fully arrived. Those moments rescued her from the edges of dread. They were evidence both of his capacity for ordinary devotion and of the complicated truth she was learning to live with. Other signs persisted. There were times when the reflection in a store window lagged behind the person in the glass by the merest breath, an optical hiccup that made her stomach clench with premonitory nausea. She learned to catalog brightnesses, the way a scale caught light in a particular gradient, the manner in which the luminous cloth bent light into a muted green, the way the suitcase's latch left a cool ring on her palm if she laid her fingers across it. Each detail became a syllable in a language she had not known she would need. On a weekday that had the light of early autumn, thin, sharp, early gold, Maike told her he had to travel on short notice, a day trip for meetings that would impinge on their evening plans. He left at dawn with a pressed suit and the black suitcase, which he took with him the way someone takes a service dog down a flight of stairs. Quietly, decisively, with a tenderness that made looking away feel like disloyalty. He promised to call. He did not. The call came at night from a hotel that registered as a place with neutral hospitality and a faintly metallic scent on the line that made her think of the park in rain. She lay awake and counted the soft hisses that came from outside the city, a low, patient noise that sometimes crept into their apartment at night. She turned the velvet box over in her palm and felt the small scale like a fossil of a past discovery. When the phone rang in the small hours, Maike's voice on the line was distant in a literal, not just emotional way. He spoke of meetings, of donors, of plans. He asked if she slept. When she said no, he was quiet for a long time and then murmured, as if remembering a courtesy, that he loved her. The next day she received a press release with glossy images of Maike at a small philanthropic dinner in a town not far from the city, the black suitcase staged on a side table as the night's centerpiece. She saw a photograph where he stood at a lectern, the suitcase open beside him, the luminous cloth peeking out like a small sunrise. The caption read, "A display of honor." The article talked about legacy and artifacts and the way personal rituals can enliven public life. Her stomach rolled with a nausea that had less to do with shame than with the sense of being made into a ledger item, along with his other proud objects. Kem noticed the change. He came over the next morning with a notebook full of precise lines. "If you're going to keep living with this," he said, sitting at the kitchen table and opening his notebook like a map, "then you need failing points. You need boundaries that are not just private whispers, but structural. Ask for days without the suitcase. Request as if it's a document, a list of what is acceptable to be public. Make it contractual to yourself, if nothing else." Would he agree? She asked, because asking the question aloud made the answer heavier. "He might not," Kem said, "but if you don't ask, you've already agreed." She found herself that afternoon asking in a way that felt like negotiating a treaty. It was not always easy to make the private a thing with borders. He listened in the room lit exactly as he liked it, lamplight soft and precise. And when she brought up the idea of setting days for the suitcase to be absent from public life, he met her with a look that carried no defensiveness. "Boundaries are forms of respect," he said. "If you set them, I will respect them." She could not tell if the promise was loyalty or a desire to be kept, but she accepted it. They agreed on pockets of time where the black suitcase would not be presented in public. He agreed to avoid performances for a week. She felt relief, which resembled both triumph and fear. But promises moved through them like a weather system, shifting, contingent. The relief lasted for a fortnight before a magazine editor called asking if Maike would open the suitcase for a feature on ritual objects, and Maike, who had the kind of charisma that could translate private things into stories for the public good, agreed. He said it was for a cause and for a careful editor who would treat the object with respect. He made it sound, in the way he always did, as if the choice was less a betrayal and more an expansion of the thing's audience. She felt betrayed nonetheless. She felt the pressure of a world that wanted to elbow open the private seam and press its face to the glow. She asked him not to go, in a voice that was more raw than she intended. He met that rawness with mild bewilderment. "I thought you wanted the world to know," he said. You told me once that spectacle isn't always exploitative. It's a kind of sharing. I didn't mean like this, she said. Not like this. After that interview, the press published images that made their private life into public myth. The suitcase became an icon, but the images were selective. Their cropping left out small domestic clarities that made the object less an artifact than an intimate presence. Readers wrote in to marvel. A stylistics column debated whether the luminous cloth was a metaphor. The household felt oddly discentered, as if something fundamental had been moved to a new cupboard where Julia could not reach. She retreated into smaller rituals. She began privately to place the small scale, her evidence and her talisman, under everyday objects. The sugar jar, a stack of unpaid bills, the small ceramic bowl where keys went. It was an act half superstitious and half practical. She wanted the scale to be part of the ordinary ledger, to normalize its presence by domesticizing it. When she slid it under the bills, it felt less like a relic than like a small, pragmatic instrument that measured the humidity of their room. Doing so calmed her in a way that practical acts often calmed a person who had been living with too much metaphoricness. There were nights when the mirror, her old friend, her private witness, refused to behave. Once, in the dim of a late winter evening when the city had the low, flat light of a town that sleeps, she stood with a cup of tea and watched as the reflection of the bedroom did something her eyes could not reconcile. The reflected Maike moved a fraction of a second before he did. The sequence was a hairline difference, imperceptible to anyone but the person who had been cataloguing small divergences for weeks. Her chest tightened with a retrograde panic that was not exactly fear, but rather the knowledge that the life she had agreed to was plural. It was in the bathroom, of all places, that the most decisive thing happened. The room was small and warm, a pool of light and sound made intimate by tile. She had been brushing her teeth and had paused, toothbrush in hand, for a private inventory, a list of all the small things she still loved about him. The mirror above the sink had condensation on its edges, little freckles of fog that made its surface plead for attention. She wiped a crescent in the glass, and then stopped, because in that cleared crescent there was a reflection that was not precisely the man in front of her. Maike stood at her shoulder in the mirror, though in the room behind her he did not. The reflected figure tilted his head as if listening to a distant conversation, and the coil she had seen at the tree hovered behind him in the mirror's depth, like a halo of folded silk. The hiss at the margins of her hearing, which she had learned to regard as the background music of private things, rose a touch in volume. She felt the room narrow to the breadth of the mirror's clearing. She turned. He was not there. Her heart beat like someone trying a lock with a bunch of keys. "Maike," she called, and her voice felt thin against the tile. The reflected Maike raised his palm, her palm, and placed it against the other side of the glass. The motion was exact, patient. For a minute that could have been a lifetime, she watched her mirrored hand and the hand in the glass come together, their surfaces meeting through the gulf of reflection. The cooling of the mirror was immediate. The surface under her fingers felt like a sheet of autumnal air. The reflected man smiled in a way that made entrails of all the choices she had been stitching together. He did not speak, but the tilt of his chin invited her. In the reflection, the coil unrolled a fraction, a small movement that suggested an answer without furnishing one. The mirror's image was not an imitation. It was a thing that had learned to inhabit its own grammar. The hiss swelled into something she could feel against the bones of her teeth, like wind across a ridge. She pressed her palm harder. For a breath, the glass accepted the pressure. The reflected hand met hers exactly, and she felt faintly, as if the warmth on the other side was not quite human warmth, but a kind of weather. Tolerable, curious, asking for company. She tasted salt at the back of her mouth and thought of leaves rustling under the great tree. A small, secret thrill passed through her. An opening. An invitation. "Come," the reflection seemed to say without lips. It was not a command so much as an offering. Come and see what I am when I don't perform for the cameras. Come if you will. Step into the seam and learn this body's particular habits. She had rehearsed this moment only in private and with trembling craft. She had run through possibilities with Kem and Dennis and had not arrived at anything but the truth that no one could answer for her. To cross through a mirror had the theatricality of a myth and the domestic terror of a decision to alter one's life in the smallest detail. She thought of the velvet box under her dressing table, the scale, the piece of mirror in her pocket, the hush of the tree at the city's edge. She thought of the life of linens, phone calls, and sleeping with a man who sometimes left and sometimes stayed. She considered leave, and she considered stay, and both felt like choices with their own economies. Her fingers trembled on the glass. The reflection's eyes were patient and deep, and in them she saw both the man she had married and the thing he carried. She could not tell whether the reflected invitation was a way into intimacy or a trap. She could not tell whether stepping through meant losing him or finding him in a deeper way. She realized with a kind of stunned clarity that she was no longer seeking to determine what he was. She was trying instead to understand the terms by which they might continue. She pressed forward. The mirrored surface gleamed and then gave the impression of thickening, like a lake that had been ruffled by wind and then smoothed by a breath. Her palm met resistance that was not hard and not soft, but the precise texture of possibility. When her body leaned toward the glass, the reflected Maike matched her movement, folding with him, as if the mirror had its own grammar for conjunction. For an instant, the room was all edges and light, and the hiss rose to a pitch that felt like a vowel held high. The mirror pressed back and then, impossibly, yielded. She did not think in narrative terms. There was no internal commentary about what would happen to their names in future papers. There was only the felt experience of crossing, the cool that traveled along her arm, the small sound that set her teeth to ringing, the gentle pressure as if entering a pool whose water had been warmed for her. She stepped through and felt a sensation like the closing of a book. When it was over and she was on the other side, she was astonished to find that the room was both the same and not. The tiles were the same, but the light held a greenish tint she had felt before only in the presence of the luminous cloth. The reflected Maike stood before her in a more immediate way, his coil folding and unfolding like a citizen making polite gestures. He was present in a specificity that no camera had ever recorded. Freckles by the ear, a small scar at the knuckle of his right hand, the exact architecture of his sigh. He smelled of rain on iron and something like the inside of papery leaves. "Julia," he said, and his voice was the thing she had loved, threaded with the added tenderness of not having an audience. His words were small and domestic. A man who had prepared tea for two and who had worried about the right way to fold a napkin. She stood for several heartbeats, uncomposed by the quiet ordinariness of him. In the mirror world, the hiss subsided into a background rhythm that felt like a room's ventilation system. The coil behind him moved with slow curiosity and sometimes brushed the fabric of his sleeve like a neighbor's hand. He reached out and took her hand with a tenderness that belonged to the life of smaller things. Laundry, borrowing books, touching the small mole at the base of her thumb. "Why now?" she asked, wanting an articulation that was not possible to give without betraying its own partiality. "Because," he said, "I thought you would like to know the full measure of me. Because I wanted to offer you everything without pretense. Because you stood at the tree and you did not run." "That's not an explanation," she said, because she needed the argument to be a work of words and not only of sentiment. She remembered Kem's ledger and Dennis's moral knives and the household bills that demanded a signatory. "It's not a full explanation," he admitted. "It's an invitation to live under different terms. The terms were not given as a contract. They were made of gestures. An offer to share certain nights, a promise to keep some things out of press frames, an insistence that tenderness would be neither diminished nor weaponized. He loved images of them as carefully as he loved the quiet of a particular library table. He wanted both economies to exist without annihilating each other. For a long time they spoke not in exegesis, but in the small economies of marriage. What time to lie down, which laundromat to favor, whether they might institute a ritual of Sundays without phones to protect private seams. The coil watched like a patient audience. He asked if she had been scared. She said yes. She admitted that sometimes the hiss kept the nights awake. He did not deny that his otherness could frighten. He only said he would do what he could to avoid harming her. "Can you vanish?" she asked, because that was a practical question as much as anything. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes the reflection stays when the body does not. Sometimes the body stays where my reflection goes. They are not always in alignment. Will you—" She stopped, the sentence unfinished as if the last piece would be consumed by its own breath. "Remain present," he finished for her. "Yes, I will remain present when asked." There was, in his tone, no solemn oath, no binding vow, only a domestic pledge that was both fragile and honest. She pressed her forehead to his shoulder and felt the coil's faint warmth against the fabric of his coat. There was tenderness there, real and particular and not a performance. It was not a promise that healed everything. It was a human offer of care. When she returned through the mirror to the bathroom where she had started, the room seemed to take in a new breath. The glass had the faint trace of her palm print, and the condensation had resumed its slow reclamation of clarity. The hiss in her ears had fallen to a familiar decibel. The shard in her pocket felt less like a trap and more like a key. The next weeks were a practice in new grammars. They negotiated boundaries that were practical, certain nights without public displays, certain days reserved for privacy, a listing of what was acceptable to show in interviews. He held to those agreements with the same care he brought to small domestic acts. He was still Maike with the public face that charmed editors and donors, but he allowed, more than he had before, the presence of a life that would not always be exhausted by press frames. This did not erase the strangeness. The coil still moved in ways that suggested other economies, and the black suitcase sometimes left the apartment in ways he could not fully account for. Her friends responded with the multiplicity they always had. Sonia treated the negotiations like a new brand strategy, admiring the way they made them look like people with a distinct taste for mystery. Kem continued to be her ledger keeper, arriving with new columns for agreements kept and anomalies observed. Dennis, to his credit, softened. He asked questions less to admonish and more as a form of care. His moral sniping turned into honest curiosity. Where did the mirror cross? How did she feel to hold a life that was both public and private? Living with the seam was like learning to keep a garden in a city lot. It required daily attention, sometimes pruning, sometimes watering. She placed the small scale under a stack of practical items, a pad of post-it notes, a pen holder, so it would be encountered like a useful tool, not a relic. Occasionally she would lift a pen and feel the cool of the scale through the paper, and in that small crossing of materials there was a comfort. She arranged the shard of mirror in a drawer so it would not glitter in unwanted light, but she took it out often enough to make sure it had not lost the capacity to surprise her. There were times when Maike's body retreated from the room in ways that left her with a new kind of loneliness. The type you get accustomed to in households with complicated rhythms. Someone gone at odd hours, someone present as a presence of otherness. He would be absent for a day and then back with the exact scent of rain and leaves. He would speak of having been somewhere that had a certain quiet, a place that stored time like a library. He never offered an atlas. He offered instead small summations, telephone numbers, the names of places he had been, gestures that made the unknown less urgent. The city took to inventing its own language about them. People wrote think pieces about performance intimacy and modern marriage. Photographers liked the imagery they could generate, the black suitcase in a doorway, the luminous cloth half spilled onto a table. There was profit in ambiguity. It sold well in a world that liked a story with a single emblem. Julia continued, however, to answer to another ethic: stewardship. Stewardship required attention and small, steady acts. She became, in a quiet way, the archivist of their life. She kept a drawer labeled with nothing but the word things, where she placed the velvet box, the smaller shard of mirror, a receipt for an old repair, a dried leaf that had been tucked into a shoe the night of an outdoor reception. She catalogued the days the hiss was louder and the days it receded. She made lists with Kem, and sometimes let Dennis read them when he visited with a look that was softer at the edges. There was no single revelation that resolved everything. There were, instead, accumulative acts that made their life legible to them, if not to the world. She learned to ask directly when something bothered her, to set conversational boundaries, to compact her fears into manageable sentences and place them on the table like coins. He replied in gestures and in small adjustments to the household choreography. Sometimes he would not keep a promise. The disappointment felt profound. Other times he surprised her by relinquishing a public demonstration in favor of a private dinner, and the sight of the coil folded neatly away beneath the table. As seasons changed, she found herself drawn occasionally to the great tree at the city's edge. It remained a boundary and an answer, a slow witness that had seen them in their early, less complicated courtship. She would sit under it with the shard of mirror in her hand and watch the wind make the leaves speak. The hiss there was less like a menace and more like a language she could almost pass. Once, as the sun dipped and the city made itself into streetlights and distant radio, she saw a figure approach with a slow, familiar gait. Maike sat beside her on the bench without the black suitcase this time, only his coat and the usual pocket-sized habits of a man who kept his life with meticulousness. They spoke not of the metaphysical but of furniture, of whether they would buy a lamp for the reading corner, of how to fold sheets to preserve linen fibers. The ordinary objects they discussed took on a delicacy. To speak of a lampshade was to speak of being present for a reading. To speak of curtains was to speak of the boundaries of light. The coil slept, folded in the trunk of a parked car some distance away, a thing that could be tended when necessary. "You could leave," he said softly at one point, as if reading the ledger she sometimes kept in her mind. "And go where?" she asked. She thought of a life stripped of the coil's mystery and the plane of possibility it allowed, a life perhaps easier to narrate but less capacious in its intimacy. "To a life where you can forget the smell of metallic rain," he said with a smile that was both rueful and tender. "To a life where your ledger is simpler." "And what would I be forgetting?" she asked. "You would forget," he said honestly, "that sometimes people arrive with things that ask to be tended rather than tamed." She thought of the life she might have without the hiss, certain, clean, headline-friendly. It would be quieter in the way empty rooms are quiet, with fewer odd gleams at the edges. But she could not imagine it without the coil, because that part of him had changed the way tenderness could be made. It had taught her that care could be an apprenticeship rather than an index. She stayed, and the decision was not immutable. It was a continuing series of commitments. As months folded, the press slowly moved on. The suitcase was no longer always an immediate fascination for the public. It had become, for many, an elegant footnote in the larger spectacle of two people's lives. That did not mean that the private life had become easier. Anomalies persisted. The occasional fleck of green on a cuff, a dampness in a cloth that suggested rain that had not fallen in the city, the mirror that sometimes showed an extra fold of coil behind a shoulder. Those details continued to punctuate and reorder their days. One afternoon, during a late spring rain, she held the small scale in the palm of her hand and watched it glow faintly between her fingers. She thought of all the ways that things asked to be counted. Money in bank accounts, endorsements, the number of guests at a wedding, the tiny number of nights a truth had been confessed in full. The scale answered none of those accounting needs. It weighed a different measure. Fidelity to mystery, a willingness to hold two truths at once. In the apartment, the mirror still kept its bargaining. Sometimes it was merciful, showing only the ordinary versions of them, him smiling at an off-handed joke, her hair disheveled in a way that made him laugh. Other times it was exacting, presenting fractions of him and thereby demanding renewed stewardship. She learned patience with the mirror's economy. She learned to let it surprise her without dissolving into panic. When the hiss rose too loud, she would take the shard and tuck it back into the drawer. Or she would place the velvet box beneath a stack of bills and fold the ordinary world over it until it quieted. The last image the story held for her, the one that threaded through years in small, dependable ways, was not a grand revelation, but a domestic act of care. One evening she stood at the kitchen counter after a meal they had cooked together, the apartment smelling of onions and lemon. She opened the drawer and removed the velvet box, then the small scale. She wrapped the scale in a tea towel and set it beneath a pot of basil, where it would be shaded and useful, a place where she would look for it when she needed small assurance. She set the mirror shard on a shelf among books whose titles suggested worldly things: travel, history, recipes. She placed on the shelf beside the shard a small object he had loved, an old fountain pen with a cracked cap. She did not call the arrangement an ending. She called it a stewardship practice, an ongoing attention to how their lives would be lived under the strangeness they had inherited together. It was not a domestication so much as a settlement, an acceptance to inhabit the seams instead of letting them tear the cloth. Outside, the great tree at the city's edge continued to breathe its low hiss into the nights. Sometimes she would walk there alone, and sometimes with him, and sometimes he would send her a note, a small drawing of a coil folded like a napkin, a line from a book he loved. They kept their public face with the same artistry as before: visits, photographs, events, because the world made contracts with image. They kept their private life with equal rigor. The economy of their days now included both, the currency of cameras and the quieter currency of listening. On certain evenings, the mirror still offered temptations and intimations, and sometimes a reflected Maike stood on the other side, inviting her again to cross. She did not always cross. She had learned that the crossing was not a one-time act, but a way of deciding, each time anew, whether to enter and how long to remain. She kept a list in her head of rules she had made. Ask first, agree to terms, keep small artifacts close, never allow the public to eclipse domestic tenderness. The rules were not immutable. They were practices. When guests asked if she regretted the night of their wedding, the glitter, the falling money, the suitcase open like an altar, she sometimes answered with a smile and a kind of scholar's resignation. It was a beginning, she would say, not a full disclosure. It was a phrase that had the advantage of economy. It let the listener imagine closure without actually receiving it. It let her maintain the tender paradox that on her wedding night a truth had been revealed, and that the reveal had not eliminated mystery, but instead made room for a life that would be measured in small attentions. She kept the small scale under ordinary objects for reasons that were not entirely clear even to her. Perhaps it was superstition, perhaps it was logic. More honestly, it was a ceremony of custody, an ongoing promise that some things deserved to be seen and tended rather than stripped and sold. In the quiet finality of a night when the city sighed and the hiss at the edge of hearing softened into sleep, she placed a pair of reading glasses atop the drawer where the velvet box lived, and with a private gesture, slid the mirror shard beneath a stack of magazines so that its glint might be encountered accidentally, like an unexpected memory. She had learned that there was no heroic exit line she could give that would render the life simple. There was only the daily practice of choosing among seams. Sometimes she woke with fury, and at other times with a tender gratitude she could not explain. She carved out both feelings with equal reverence. On the windowsill where the light came in late and made the dust look like small galaxies, she set the small scale under a jar of pencils. It sat there like a quiet talisman among mundane tools. The mirror on the wall reflected the room in a way that admitted both its ordinary ordinariness and the possibility of other things. She stood before it sometimes and pressed a finger to the glass, not to cross, but to remember the texture of the choice she had made. They lived in two economies, as the city continued to document and as their friends continued to remark. But she had become less interested in reconciling those economies and more interested in stewarding them. It was a form of hospitality. She welcomed both the public image that fed their life and the private strangeness that asked for company. The two did not cancel each other out. They braided. In the small hours of a late autumn morning, when leaves compiled themselves into little, rumorous piles outside, and the apartment had the hush of a house that has learned to breathe slowly, she took the velvet box from her drawer and set it on the kitchen table beside a plain mug of tea. She placed the small scale on top and covered it with a dish towel. The room smelled of lemon and old paper. She felt not triumph, but a kind of tender, perpetual responsibility. Stewardship cannot be performed like a single act. It is a practice of daily devotion. She allowed herself one last moment of theatricality. She picked up the pen Maike liked, a small fountain pen that was neither showy nor discreet, and wrote in the margin of a calendar a simple notation, a private agreement, that read, "Nights without spectacle." She folded the scrap of paper and tucked it into the drawer beside the mirror shard. It was a small law for their household. When she closed the drawer, the hiss at the edge of the city sounded like a small animal settling down for the night. The tree at the city's edge exhaled its leaves, and the mirror on the wall gathered in its glass the life that had learned to be both public and hidden. Julia sat at the table and drank her tea, the scale beneath the towel a quiet heartbeat. She had chosen not a single narrative but the work of arranging their days so that all the truths they carried, public ceremony and private otherness, might be tended rather than consumed. If you have a theory about what he is, leave it below.